Thank you, Bob. Good evening, everybody. It's such a privilege for me to be here tonight and to share a little bit of what my husband and I, and actually a lot of people do in Zimbabwe in terms of mission work. And yes, I'm sure you all expected me to be black. Most people would expect me to be black, considering that our white population is 0.2%. And Craig and I are both native Zimbabweans. We have a funny accent because we were originally a British colony, and so we have an accent that's more British blended than Southern. Although it is really fun to be in the south of America and get to hear y'all, you know. I don't do that very well, so. But it's lovely to be here, and thank you so much for giving me the time. So let me try and paint you a big picture. It's very hard to try and squeeze everything in, I understand, but keep your questions for the end and I'll do my best to answer your questions. So let me try and paint you a big picture of what Zimbabwe looks like, and then I'll try and give you a small picture of what Craig and I do in terms of ministry, and then a little bit about, if you wanted to, how you could help with that. So big picture Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe was a British colony. In 1965, they declared something called the UDI, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, where they broke away from the British government, and it was a hustle over because the whites wanted it to remain a white-ruled nation, and Britain wanted it to be a majority rule, which obviously was black people. That then turned into civil war in about 1975. And from 1975 to 1980, there was civil war in what was then called Rhodesia. In 1980, the war was won by the black Zimbabweans, and Zimbabwe became an independent nation. And they gained their independence, and the name was changed from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe. If you go and have a look at a map and you're not sure where Zimbabwe is, if you look at the map of Africa, go right to the bottom. And the bottom country right on the tip is called South Africa. We are just north of South Africa, and we're a little country shaped in the shape of a teapot. And that is Zimbabwe. We are a landlocked country, and we have 5 surrounding nations. So that'll give you a clue as to where to look. In 1980, Robert Mugabe became the president. In the early 1980s, as is usual in African countries, when an African leader comes to power, he will do anything and everything he can to obliterate his opposition. Not many people know, but in the early 1980s, Mugabe trained a special forces unit that was trained in North Korea, and they moved down to the southern part of Zimbabwe called Matabeleland, and he massacred hundreds of thousands of his opposition, and has ruled in fear ever since. Mugabe is a dictator. He is still in power. He is now 91 years old. Okay, and he's not about to let go anytime soon. Okay, so what does that mean for Zimbabwe? In 1980, as Bob said, the US dollar and the Zimbabwe dollar were 1-to-1. In 1997, when they came, it was 1-to-10. Then some drastic things happened. In 1998, there were a bunch of war veterans who, when Mugabe was parading to become president and vying for votes, in his campaigns, he promised the war veterans land. And he said, if you vote for me, I will give every person land. Well, it didn't happen because Zimbabwe was run on agriculture. That was our main earner. Zimbabwe is a very wealthy country in terms of mineral wealth. We have huge resources of platinum, gold, diamonds, copper, zinc, and so it goes on and on. And Mugabe knew that was the way the country was being held up. We also had a huge agricultural sector. So in 1985, we were the breadbasket of Africa. Even in 1995, we were the breadbasket of Africa. But these guys came forward and they said, no, you promised that you would give us a reward and you haven't done it. In 1998, sometime in November, there was something called the Black Friday, where Mugabe decided as the president of the country, he could make decisions by himself, and he emptied our stores he emptied the Reserve Bank completely and split it up between the war veterans and gave them huge pensions and salaries that would go on for the rest of their life. What he didn't bargain on was that overnight the value of the dollar dropped. Obviously, most people would know that. And so suddenly our dollar lost value quite quickly. Well, the war veterans weren't very happy with that, because when they were first paid out, they thought they had a fortune. But within 10 days, it wasn't worth anything. And so they began going back to Mugabe and saying, it's not enough. In 2000, Mugabe began losing popularity, and so he began something called a land redistribution program. The land redistribution program effectively was a case of taking, and at that point it was white commercial farmers who were targeted, and he actually created a monster that he couldn't control, and the war veterans were given free rein to go onto the farms and take over. And so we had this chaotic situation in the year 2000 where farmers were being murdered, workers were being displaced, their houses were being burnt to the ground, and Mugabe was moving in his henchmen. Often it was led by a government minister who already owned 2 or 3 farms, and there's lots of politics and history behind that as well, which I don't have time to go into right now. But effectively what happened was overnight our agricultural sector shut down, as did our economy. So tourism was a huge thing. We were exporting beef to the EU, we were exporting tobacco to the world markets, we were exporting cotton, we had exports all over the world, and overnight that just shut down. So our economy imploded. From the year 2000 to about 2009, the hyperinflation just began to climb steadily, as you can imagine. And so I think we had 5 or 6 different currencies, different sets of money. One was cancelled, and then another one was brought in, and then one was cancelled, and they would reprint. They actually couldn't print money fast enough, which is normal for a hyperinflation situation. In the year 2009, I think our hyperinflation reached 2.9 billion%, which just seems bizarre. So the highest note that we ever got to was a $100 trillion note, and that had already had 23 zeros taken off it. So what they would do is you would get a currency, and then they would say, no, we're slashing 3 zeros, we're slashing 10 zeros, we're slashing 13 zeros, we're slashing, and so that's how they would continue to keep the currency moving. By that stage, everything was, as you can imagine, on the black market. Zimbabwe dollars weren't worth anything. In fact, I remember walking into the South African border post and seeing a notice on the wall saying, in the toilets, please don't use newspaper, paper towels, or Zimbabwe dollars. Because it was actually cheaper to wipe yourself with a Zimbabwe dollar than it was to buy toilet paper. Okay, just so you know. In the year 2007, something happened that I would refer to as legal looting. And what happened was Mugabe accused the economy of creating the hyperinflation. And so he demanded that everything go under price controls, and that would be across the board. And the way he monitored that was by sending in the army and the police. And so every shop was invaded by army and police. They were told, regardless of what price they had paid, they were told what price things would be sold for. And before things were actually put out or the front doors of the shop were open, the back doors would be open. The army and the police walked in, they loaded the trucks with whatever they would like, and they drove off. There were then police and army officers left within the store. The front doors then opened, and the public could then come in and effectively clean out the shop at prices that were less than cost. So shop owners and business owners were in a very tight position. And the government, most people, I'm sure in your economy, would say, you know what, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. The government then came in and said, if you close your business, we're going to take it. And so we had all these shops standing wide open with not even a teaspoon of salt for sale. But the employers would have to pay the staff and all of that stuff. And so it was a pretty hectic time. So you say, so what has that got to do with you? Well, Craig and I, my husband, Craig, and I have two boys. One is 12 and one is 9, who are back in Zimbabwe. My husband at the moment is in Pittsburgh. Craig was called to teach at the Theological College of Zimbabwe. And we had come to Gordon Conwell Seminary up in the North Shore to come and do his master's degree, which we did between 2003, 2004. And then we returned to Zimbabwe in 2005 in order for Craig to go and teach. But what had happened, because the economy was imploding, the college, before we came back, asked us to raise our own salary. Because at that time, there is no internal funds with which to raise salaries within the country. So it was very tricky, and so our journey began, and we're still on that journey. And it was interesting because it was people kept saying, well, why don't you stay in the United States? Be a Mexican, cross the border. Don't, And we said, no, God has called us back to go and serve the people we love. There are many people in Zimbabwe who have no voice, they have no opportunity, they have no education. And what right do we have to sit comfortably on the other side and say, I'm okay? So we really felt God calling us back to Zimbabwe. And it's interesting because God has really worked in our lives, probably more than a lot of other people's lives. So I'll tell you a couple of things about Zimbabwe. One of the things is that right now we have 95% unemployment. Okay? So our nation has been turned into a nation of beggars. Zimbabweans are not lazy by nature. They are not people who would sit at home and watch TV and wait for a government handout. There are no government handouts. And so if you're going to live, you have to do something in order to earn an income. Sadly, I have pictures, but I have no way of displaying them, but that's okay. Sadly, our nation has turned into a bunch of people sitting on the pavement, selling 6 or 7 tomatoes, 4 onions, a couple of pieces of candy. That's how they make their living. And it's to those people that we are called. And we have had amazing opportunities. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories, and then we can talk a little bit more. So we had a situation where our church is right in the heart of the city. And a couple of years ago, we were in a position where we were saying, do we need to move out of the city and become a suburban church? And we said, no, God has called us to be here right now in this place, serving these people. But we have no parking. We have no way of getting into the building because the pavement and the road are all these people trying to make a living. And so there's piles of clothing, and there's rotten tomatoes, and there's trash, and there's people, there's babies growing up on the street. There are people on loudspeakers over there, and there are people selling rat poison over there, and it's busy. It's busy. And so we had been praying and saying, how do we reach out to these people? I don't know. One day we had a lady come into the office, and she said, I'm wondering if you can help me. We used to run a preschool at this church many years ago. I'm looking for a lady that worked here. I said, I'm sorry, I can't help you. At the time, I was in the church office. 2 days later, a black lady came in and she said, I wonder if you can help me. You used to run a preschool here, and I used to work here. I said, pardon? She said, I used to work here. I said, what is your name? She said, Beauty and Porful. I said, Beauty, would you take a seat right there? And I phoned the other lady and I said, you better come quick, because the lady you were looking for has just walked in. So the other lady came and they had a conversation, and it turned out that this African lady was looking for a place to run a preschool because she had started her own preschool, but it was, they had lost their premises and they were looking for someone to move. As a deacons board, we chatted and we said, you know what, maybe this could work. So we asked her, we said, Beauty, would you be willing for us to subsidize your rent, and would you be willing to consider taking some of these vendors' children who are on the street and educating them? And she said, I'd love to. Well, we now have a preschool at our church that is more vendors' children than it is regular kids, which is amazing, and it's only God. And so Craig and I have opportunities like this to be involved. Craig teaches at a theological seminary, and Craig gets to train pastors. And the pastors struggle. They struggle to get their funds together to do the courses. They struggle with the whole cultural expectation. And there's many cultural expectations that are very different to what Scripture would pertain to. So he has a student who had an 18-year-old son who one day just wasn't there. His clothes were there, everything was in place, he was gone. He was gone. And you can imagine, the parents are frantic. They have got no idea what's happened to their son. They're asking friends and neighbors. There is no sign of him. The guy came to college that day and he spoke to Craig and he said, Craig, I'm really stuck. I don't know what to do. And Craig said, well, let's pray. And so they did. They prayed and they said, Lord, our son is lost, but he's not lost to you. You know exactly where he is. We ask that you would hold him and protect him, give the parents wisdom. Weeks went by, and the mother's family began pressuring and saying, you guys know what you need to do. You know that you need to go to the witch doctor so that he can approach the ancestors, because they'll find out where your son is. And the wife said, well, I'll talk to my husband. And she said to her husband, she said, you know, maybe we should do this. And her husband said, no. We've been studying the Bible, and I can tell you that God knows where our son is. We need to trust the Lord. And so his wife stood with him and said, you know what, we're not going to go to the Nanga. We're not going to approach the ancestors. We're just going to pray. 2 days later, they got a phone call from their son. Hi, Mom, I'm in South Africa. I just went to go and find a job. I'm fine. But what a testimony of people who are really tested against their culture. And so there's many, many, many stories like that. Craig and I get to brush shoulders with all kinds of people. I work at a baby's home that has been set up for abandoned babies. So babies that are they're dumped into the trash, they're left on the streets, they're left on a bus, they get caught, they get brought into a police station. The police station then phones social services that don't really exist, and then they get in touch with one of the many orphanages. So here's another statistic. We have 95% unemployment. 10% of our population are orphans. We have a huge rate of HIV and AIDS. In 2008, when things were really bad, when you couldn't buy a teaspoon of salt, and we had $100 trillion notes floating around in bricks, and they wouldn't buy you anything, our death rate was higher than that of Darfur. And we were a nation that didn't have a drought, and we weren't at war. And so it's just the way that a dictator is able to ruin a country, effectively. And so we have, as a result of this, all these orphans. We have 1.3 million orphans in our nation. They all need to know that somebody loves them. I'm very privileged to work with a baby's home for abandoned babies. We have 24 children, from newborn to about 3.5 or 4, and they in that time, what we try and do is we try and get them fostered and adopted out. I know one of the questions that's going to come from the audience is, can we adopt children? No, you can't. Zimbabwe does not allow international adoptions. It's also for cultural reasons and other things, but it is closed to international adoptions, which creates an even larger burden on the population to care for their children when there is no income. Another story, a quick one, before I close and ask for questions. I've talked way too long. A few months ago, I went to help with a program called Riding for the Disabled. One of the things that happens culturally in Zimbabwe is if you are mentally or physically disabled, especially when you're born, the family pulls back. They believe that it's a curse. They believe that it may be an evil spirit. They believe that it's some kind of sign that there's trouble, and they will abandon those children. So many of these children don't have families. And so there's a school called KG6, which takes in all these children who are born with deformities of different kinds. And there is a program running in Bulawayo now that's run by a private horse ranch, I don't know what you would call it, kind of farm. It's not very big. But they allow these children to come in once or twice a week to do therapy. And they get on the horses and they get to ride, and the smiles are just beautiful. But I was there one day with my friend, and the bus arrived and all these kids got off, and then I saw this boy. And I thought, wow. And I went over to one of the staff and I said, tell me the story. And she said, she said, that boy's name is Mike. Mike is now 16 years old. And there is nothing wrong with him, except up until Mike was 14, he was a normal, boisterous boy who would run in the bush and do whatever. And he lived in the rural areas. And at the age of 14, he stepped on a live power line. And he was electrocuted. And he lost both his arms and both his legs. Mike rides horses. No arms and no legs. And it is amazing. He sits on the horse, and as he turns his torso, so the horse turns. When he leans back, the horse stops. When he leans forward, the horse walks. He is incredible. In America, people would leap up and say, my goodness, you need an electric wheelchair, you need a prosthesis, you need a... It's not available in Zimbabwe. And I was completely struck, and I thought, I need to do something for this child. I don't know what to do. I have no resources of my own. But you know what? We serve an amazing God who has provided and provided and provided and provided when we thought that there was no provision to be had. And I know that God is going to take care of Mike, because Mike is one of his own. And I just, I think, as I was traveling across to the States, I was thinking about the Boston bombing. And I know for you guys, Boston is 100 years ago, or 100 miles away. But when you hear Boston bombing, everybody goes, yes, I know where Boston is, and I know what happened. There's a little boy in Zimbabwe who has no arms and legs. He needs help. You know what? As I talk to people, I know that there's people out there with connections and friends and relatives. Maybe you've got an idea. I don't know. But those are the sorts of things that Craig and I deal with on a day-to-day basis. So you may be asking, so why are you telling us all this? Well, we need your prayers. As a family, we live in Zimbabwe. We are not a popular race, being white. Mugabe has worked very hard to get rid of as many whites as possible. We are native born, so he doesn't really have much chance of kicking us out. Many people leave willingly. So Zimbabwe is in the midst of a very big brain drain because people want to get out of Zimbabwe. But we need your prayer. We need you to be praying for Zimbabwe. Pray for our nation. Pray for the people of Zimbabwe who have no hope and nowhere to go. So that's all I'm going to tell you for now. But if there are any questions, I'm very happy to answer some questions for you. Yeah?
What are the religions that you encounter there? Are they mostly Catholic or?
That's a good question. So, in terms of religion in Zimbabwe, 85% of Zimbabweans would claim to be Christian. Okay? But it's interesting because we're also in the top 10% of the most corrupt countries in the world. So that statistic doesn't really tie up. When you take a more detailed study, we do have a significant section of Catholics, but the biggest two sections, one is extreme charismatic, so the health, wealth and prosperity gospel is huge in Africa, and the other one is a sect in which they combine cultural beliefs with Christianity. And so suddenly my mic's come on. And so they kind of worship God through the ancestors. And so those are two that's the majority of, and then there's a very minimal band of broad evangelical churches, mainstream being Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, non-denominational, etc. Anything else?
Did I hear that you were born there? You are from there?
That's correct. So Craig and I are both native Zimbabwean. We are second and third generation Zimbabwean. Yeah.
Who led you to the Lord?
Who led me to the Lord? That is a very good question. My goodness. My testimony is effectively that my mum was a very severe alcoholic and my dad wasn't much further behind. And from a very young age, I learned that God was the only person that I could trust. And as I look back, I see that God actually surrounded our family with Christians from day dot, which fascinated me because we weren't the kind of people you wanted to hang around. But I had started attending church at a very young age and kind of came to faith at, I chose to be baptized at about the age of 11. Yeah. So, and then just kept growing from there.
Where do you get most of the food that you do eat, since it's so expensive?
That's a good question. So the cost of living in Zimbabwe is very high and the salaries are very low. So a lot of the food is now imported from South Africa or Botswana. And because the economy has imploded and there's no industry of its own within Zimbabwe, the only way that the government can make money is by charging duties on imported goods. So most of the food is brought in from South Africa, and our minimum wage is less than 50 cents an hour. My husband, as a lecturer with a master's degree, earns $667 a month. And so, yeah, it's very... And your fuel is $2 something a gallon, is it? Ours is $5.80. So it's a big difference, yeah.
You got all these minerals up there. Where does the money go for those? Sure it's big mine.
Okay, you're going to have to repeat that really slowly.
Minerals, that's in.
Oh, yes, the minerals?
Right. Is that being mined and sold? And is the dictator that he's using that money to support his military, I assume?
Yeah. So Zimbabwe is very mineral rich. At this point, there is very little to no investment at all. So in that sense, it's been a good thing because it has protected the mineral resources that are there. One of the things that's happened is the government has come across a huge, they call it a wash of diamonds. It's not really a stream of diamonds. They seem to think that it's a wash down from, I don't really understand mining, but they're literally able to scoop them off the ground. And that is the way Mugabe is funding his government, and using it to empower the army and other things. Yeah.
Are your boys homeschooled or do they attend school?
My boys are very fortunate. They attend a private Christian school. So in terms of education, there's kind of two options. The government system, which is barely existent and has less than a 2% pass rate at kind of SAT level. And then the private sector, which kind of sprung up after 1980 when the government kind of took over. And so my children attend a private Christian school. The good thing, the good, the bad, and the in-between, Craig has just been asked to become the spiritual director of that Christian school. And so as of May, when we go back, Craig will be overseeing the discipleship and teaching of the 100 members of staff that are there, some who are Christian, some who are not, and 1,000 children. Ranging from the ages of about 5 to 19. So that's an amazing opportunity, because a lot of the kids don't come from Christian homes. No more questions? Oh, one more? Yeah?
Are the Christians being persecuted there?
Thankfully not. And that's one of the amazing things about Zimbabwe. It is wide open to the gospel. Wide open. The challenge with that is that the health, wealth, and prosperity are just going through there like wildfire. And so many people are being misled. And so they will do things like they will say, okay, everybody, I want you to wave your offering in the sky. Okay, that's not enough. Let's try again. And they'll do that 5 or 6 times. And then people will come up for prayer and they'll say, well, if you really want God to heal you, then you need to sow into this ministry. And so it's just taking advantage of the poorest of the poor. And so these people are sowing into this ministry, and the pastor is driving around in a Mercedes-Benz, and most of his congregation are sitting on the pavement selling tomatoes, trusting that they need to grow their faith in order to be blessed. It's very scary. Is that it? Yep.
So when this dictator died in 1991, okay, is it set up who will succeed him, or is it just going to be a wide open mess?
Okay, B would be the answer to that. We trust that one of these days he will fall off his perch. Nobody can live forever. Up until 20 years ago, I think that there would have been viable opposition and some kind of organizing in the way that things would have been structured. Sadly, corruption has now become so entrenched in the society that I feel that it will just be chaos. His wife is actually bidding very hard to take over to be successor, which is bad news. She's about 50. She has no political background whatsoever, and she is wicked. So in the last 3 or 4 months, Mugabe has he's fired about 28 of his closest cabinet ministers, including his vice president, who was head of the army. And so there's lots of tension and turmoil within the ruling party. So I fear that if it happens anytime soon, there will be great chaos.
So what happens to these fired people?
Hopefully they've stashed enough millions away that they can go and retire on an island in Miami or somewhere. I don't know. But they work very hard while they're in power to gain wealth. That's kind of why they're there. They're not there for the people.
Well, even at your husband's salary, which is probably much better than a lot of people there,
Mm-hmm.
I don't see how you could get by.
Yeah.
It's got to be tough when you're importing your food. Gas is $5 a gallon.
And we live by faith. So let me tell you a quick story that will emphasize that. And when I say we live by faith, we live day by day. So we have so many stories that we could tell you. When Craig and I were planning on coming to Gordon Conwell, we had a lecturer from Gordon Conwell come and say, well, tell us about your dream. And me, being me, began to laugh. And they said, Mel, why are you laughing? And I said, do you understand that even if Gordon Conwell gave us 100% tuition scholarship, the living expenses just for 2 years for us to be at Gordon Conwell would take 76 years of Craig and my combined salary before tax. So that just kind of puts it into perspective. And you know what? God provided. And He continues to provide, the big, the small, and the in-between. So in December, things were particularly tight for our family. And I was kind of grumbling. And I was saying, Lord, I'm tired of struggling. I'm tired of having to buy 1 tomato and 2 onions and a packet of ground beef and hope that that's going to last me 3 days. You know, I'm just tired. And I don't have any dried fruit to make a Christmas cake. I've got no cocoa. I can't even bake a chocolate cake. And I'm miserable. And I was just I was muttering. And then I said, Lord, I'm sorry, because you are able and I need to quit moaning. That day I walked into the school office and somebody was eating some cake. And she said, oh, I can't stand this bought cake. I always taste the egg. And I said, well, make a cake without egg. And she said, how do you do that? So I said, no, I've got a recipe. And, I said, I'll bring the recipe in for you. And she said, no, you make the cake. Now, immediately my head's going, I don't have the ingredients. So I said, well, yeah, no, I'll bring you the recipe. She said, no, I want you to make the cake. She said, and I'll pay you for it. So I said, eesh. So I said, how big a cake do you want? She said, no, I want a big one. So I said, okay. So she said, how much will it be? So now I'm on the spot and I'm thinking, oh, okay, cocoa. If I buy a kg of cocoa, if I buy a bag of flour. So I said, $20. And she said, done. Got it. So I said, okay. So I said, Lord, that's money for my cocoa. So I took the money and I went down to the store. And I buy a kg of cocoa at a time just because it's so much cheaper. And instead of being $14, it was $13. And I was like, yes, I can buy bread today. So I went home and I was all smiles and I made the chocolate cake and I took it to school the next day and she was so delighted. She was so excited. And then that night, my son had Bible study. So I took him to the Bible studies, the leader's house, and I walked him in and their daughter said, Auntie Mel, don't go. And I said, why? And she said, no, my mom wanted me to give you something. And she ran into the kitchen, and lo and behold, she came out with 1 kg of cake mix for a fruit cake. I was flabbergasted. I was like, Lord, I feel sorry for people who are in the first world, who don't get to see this kind of miracle on a day-by-day basis. It's just incredible. Incredible. My son last year was chosen for a very prestigious choir school in South Africa. And with prestigious comes price. And the price was $100,000 a year. And we'd said, that's lovely. And thankfully my son said, Mom, I don't want to go. And I said, okay, that's fine, I can do this. And then in December he came to me and said, but I'd really like to do voice lessons. And I said, oh, okay. So I said, you know what, Brett? I said, we just need to pray. Because if God wants you to do voice lessons, He'll make a way. So we prayed. Nothing happened. At the end of December, one of the ladies in Bulawayo who does voice lessons started attending our church. So I went to her and I said, Sarah, I don't know if you can help me. I said, I know nothing about music and singing and yada yada. I said, and I'm wondering, do you know where I would go for voice lessons and how much they are? And she said, oh, I do voice lessons, and they're $30 an hour. And I said, oh. And she said, but it's good. You shouldn't do just 1 a week. I said, oh, okay. And she said, why do you ask? So I said, well, my son's kind of interested in singing. And she said, well, I do something called a pitch class, which is a bunch of teenagers. We come together, we sing once a week, and it's free. I said, this works. So I said, do you mind if Brett attends? And she said, no, that's great. So the first week I take Brett along, and he loves it, and I go to fetch him afterwards, and she calls me aside, and she said, Mel, your son has an incredible voice. And I said, I know, thank you, bye. And we scooched out the door. And Brett said, Mom, that was so much fun. And I said, Lord, I can't do this. So at the end, just before we left, literally the week before we left, she scooched up to me in church and she said, Mel, I have a free space in my voice training lessons. And I said, oh. And she said, I would really like to coach Brett. And I said, oh. And I'm thinking, how am I going to let her down slowly and say, that's really lovely, but sorry, it's just not going to happen. And she said, but there's a catch. She said, I'd really like to do it for free. You know what? That's the God we serve. And guys, I want to encourage you, that's the God you serve. Trust Him, trust Him day by day. And for us, it's amazing that we get that opportunity to serve God that way every day. And when you haven't got resources of your own, I can't just, when somebody comes to my gate and says, excuse me, madam, I need money for HIV drugs. I know how desperate that is. I know that they've got to take it every day at the same time in the same quantity, otherwise they become resilient to it. I know that. But when I haven't got anything to give them, I can take them to my Creator and say, you know what, guys, let's go together. Let's pray because God is able, and it builds up everybody's faith. So that's my story. That's where I come from. That's what we do. That's how we live. Thank you for giving me your time. I'm sorry that it's been 45 minutes. I need to sit down. So thank you.